He stood in a garden with a strip of black cloth over his eyes, 3 arrows already drawn, 1 knocked against the string. Around him, guests had gone quiet. The particular quiet of a crowd that has stopped breathing because they understand, on instinct, that something real is happening and they are not equipped for it. Somewhere to his left, Lin Shi's breath had gone shallow. Ahead, he could hear the creak of a bowstring already drawn. He didn't know the shooter's distance by sight. He'd measured it in the 3 seconds before the blindfold went on. 31 feet, stone arch at the left edge, table at 45 degrees from center. The person drawing the bow slightly outside that table. He built the picture from memory and held it. The release came. A whisper of fletching through cold night air. He raised his bow at an angle he could not have calculated with his eyes open, not consciously anyway, and fired. The incoming arrow shattered 6 feet short of the crowd. His second and third arrows followed within 2 breaths, hitting the target board in twin strikes that landed close enough to touch. For a moment, no one in the garden moved. Then someone screamed, and the man who had shoved Lin Shi toward the arrow's path was already reaching for his collar, already swallowing, and Shan was already lowering his bow. He knew that move, a man reaching for his collar in the seconds after a plan had failed. He'd seen it in 2 countries. By the time anyone reached the figure, he was on his knees, and he stayed there. But to understand how a blindfolded man standing at a birthday party came to split an assassin's arrow out of the sky, you'd need to go further back. Not to that evening. 10 years back, to the morning everything ended, and the morning that it started again. Shan woke up on cold tile smelling of cleaning solution and mildew. He lay on the floor of a high school bathroom stall, staring up at a fluorescent light that buzzed and flickered on one side. He knew that buzz. He knew the crack in the third stall's door hinge and the initials someone had scratched into the paint near the window in 2012, and the soap dispenser that hadn't worked since he'd punched it at 15. He lay there for 2 full seconds, understanding. Then he turned his hands over. No calluses, no scar below the left thumb from a border fight he couldn't name in any official report. The musculature was soft and untested. The body of a boy who had never gone 3 days without sleep in the rain, with 40 kilos on his back. He pressed both palms against the tile and sat up slowly, with the deliberate control of a man checking a weapon for damage. His mind was 26. The reflexes were 26. The body was 16, soft and unformed, but the nerve-deep memory lived in it like water in a sponge. The toilet in the next stall flushed. A classmate came out and looked down at him, asking if he'd fainted. Shan told him he was fine and got to his feet in one smooth motion. Too controlled, too settled, the movement of a man who had been on worse floors. And the classmate paused for a second before deciding not to ask anything further and leaving. Shan stood at the sink. He ran water cold and pressed it to his face. The mirror showed a boy. Behind the boy's eyes lived a decade of war. He needed to think quickly, because he knew the date, April 12, 2015. He had died in a different season, in a different country, on a mission that was supposed to be clean. His team had gone into a building, hit their targets, and on the way out, his own partner put a round in his back at close range. 1 shot, deliberate. He'd been unconscious before he hit the ground, and dead before they found him. In the strange clarity that comes when a body shuts down, he'd understood money. His partner had been bought, and the hand holding the money, though he hadn't confirmed it with certainty until the last possible moment, belonged to a family called Chen, out of Jiuning City, with a smooth eldest son named Xuan Chen, who had once offered Shan a bottle of water before a deployment and smiled warmly while doing it. He didn't let himself sit with that long, because standing in a school bathroom with his dead man's face in the mirror, the betrayal was the second thing on his mind. The first thing was 2 floors up. The clock above the sink read 9:47. He had 13 minutes. In his original life, April 12, 2015 had not been the day he died. That was later. This was the day something worse happened. Worse because he'd been there and done nothing. A man had slipped into the girls' showers through a service corridor during the morning rush. The teachers were slow to respond. Shan had been standing right outside the door. He'd heard the screaming, and he had frozen. Not from cowardice he could articulate, just the particular paralysis of a 16-year-old who didn't yet know what his body could do, who believed, in that fraction of a second, that someone older and more capable was already handling it. No one was. The girl inside was Lin Shi, daughter of Colonel Lin, the one who always had ink on her left hand from writing too fast in class, who kept two pens behind her ear and used neither because she kept forgetting one was already there. She disappeared from school within 3 months of that day and never came back. What happened to her after that, Shan had never been able to confirm. He'd tried, once, from overseas, and gotten nothing useful. He'd gone into the military the following year, became good at it quickly. Shame was excellent fuel. He would not freeze again. He was 26 years old in a 16-year-old's body, and he was already moving. He took the stairs without running. Running would pull attention, using the particular controlled pace that covers ground without broadcasting purpose. Through the morning hallway traffic, past a teacher without eye contact, up to the 3rd floor in under 90 seconds. The girls' changing room was at the east corridor's end. The service access was around the left turn. He came around the corner and found the service door already propped open with a fold of cardboard. Someone had planned this in advance. He went through without slowing. The passage behind smelled of old paint and dust. Ahead, the sound of something heavy falling. A sharp voice cut short, running water. He followed it to a secondary door and pushed through. The man was large, larger than Shan's current build by 40 pounds at least, and he had Lin Shi pinned against the far wall. Her eyes were shut. A 10-liter water container for gym supplies sat on the shelf 3 feet to Shan's left. He picked it up, covered the distance in 4 steps, and brought it down. The man went down hard. Lin Shi opened her eyes. Shan set the container on the floor, found a length of cord from the window blind mechanism nearby, and secured the man's wrists behind him. 6 seconds. Clean enough. He straightened up and looked at Lin Shi. She was shaking, but she was nodding, processing, not shutting down, and told her it was over. Told her she was safe. Told her not to look at the floor. She nodded again, jaw tight, hands pressing against the tile wall for something solid. He stayed until he heard footsteps at the end of the corridor, the first teacher responding, and then stepped back into the service passage and let the door close behind him. No announcement, no name given. By the time the administration reached the shower block, Shan was in his classroom with his math textbook open, and he could recite the page from memory because he'd read it a decade ago. He'd changed it. The thing he had carried for 10 years, the wound he'd reopened every time he tried to sleep in a bunk in some forward position with bad lighting and worse food, he'd walked back in and changed it in under 10 minutes. He sat at his desk and let that settle. Not triumph, something quieter and heavier. Because Lin Shi was safe, yes, but the Chen family still existed. Xuan Chen was still somewhere building toward the thing that would eventually kill him, and every piece of what came next needed to be constructed carefully. He had time. He intended to use every day of it. The first problem arrived before lunch. His name was Tian Lei, class representative, son of Vice Chief Yang, and the kind of person who confused his father's connections with his own authority. He noticed Shan during morning roll call, the way people like him always noticed anyone who moved through a room without looking at the ground. 2 of his people boxed Shan in by the lockers after second period. The setup was familiar, bodies placed slightly too close, hands loose at their sides, a wall made of implication. Tian Lei leaned against the lockers beside Shan's and asked, in the tone of someone discussing weather, why someone from Shantytown was looking so relaxed. Shan didn't answer. Beside him at his own locker, Shan's friend Jai watched all of this with the particular expression of someone waiting to see whether he needed to start running. Jai was the kind of person who'd been Shan's closest friend in this life. Big-mouthed, loyal, perpetually on the wrong side of trouble, and honest about all 3. He'd kept Shan's secrets without being asked, and gotten into fights on his behalf without being told. He was currently gripping his history book very tightly. Tian Lei stepped forward into Shan's personal space. The classic move, designed to force the smaller party back, and Shan didn't move. He stood with the stillness of someone who understood the difference between a threat and a performance. Tian Lei's hand shot out and shoved his shoulder. What happened next took under 3 seconds. The lead bodyguard stepped in as he'd been trained to, and Shan caught his wrist on the first movement, rotated at the elbow, applied downward leverage along the joint, and felt the small bones give before the man had finished exhaling. The second bodyguard stepped back immediately. Tian Lei's expression cycled through several stages: surprise, offense, fury, and landed on something dangerous. He was already reaching for his phone. Jai, beside Shan, said quietly that this was very bad. Shan said he knew. Jai asked if they should run. Shan said no. Jai took a breath and stayed, which said everything about him. The police arrived inside 40 minutes, the time it took Vice Chief Yang to make the necessary phone calls. The arresting officer barely made eye contact. The medical report that followed had numbers that didn't match anything Shan had actually done. The bodyguard's injury inflated, the description of events reordered, one specific detail fabricated entirely. Shan read it in the back of the patrol car with the calm of someone proofreading a document they'd already expected to be wrong. At the station, he walked the officer, taking his statement through each discrepancy one at a time. He cited the relevant statutes from memory. A decade of military legal training hadn't vanished with the regression, and noted, specifically, that a minor held for questioning without parental contact exceeded the permissible informal detention window by procedure alone. The officer grew visibly uncomfortable. A supervisor was called. The supervisor stepped out to take a call and came back with a different expression. The door to the interview room opened. Officer Chang walked in. He was a career military man, mid-40s, stationed under Colonel Lin, and he had a specific and well-known opinion about civilian police departments that compromised their procedures for the right family connections. He did not ask for Shan's release. He stated that it was occurring. He walked Shan to the front steps, lit a cigarette, and stood in silence for 30 seconds. Then he asked, without looking at him, what Shan had done to that bodyguard. Shan told him, wrist lock, rotational joint pressure, deliberate application. Chang exhaled a long stream of smoke, turned, and studied him for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to the street and didn't say anything further. But Shan had served long enough to recognize the look. Chang was filing something away. Shan filed something away too. This man would matter, eventually, and the impression made today would carry. He went home to his mother. She was at the stove when he came in, making the mushroom soup she started the night before on Tuesdays. The broth smell hit him at the door, and he stood in the entryway for a moment, not moving. In his original life, she had grown older alone in this apartment, while he was assigned to posts he couldn't name. He'd missed 3 of her birthdays in a row, and once sent money instead of calling, because he'd convinced himself it was the practical choice. She'd died before he made it home. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her shoulders from behind. She startled. She'd been expecting him to drop his bag on the floor and complain about something, and then went very still. Her hands hovered over the pot. She asked quietly if something had happened. He said no. He said he just wanted to. She stayed still for a moment, then patted his forearm with the hand that always had a cooking smell on it, and told him the soup needed 20 more minutes and he should wash his hands. He let go and stepped back, and the moment closed behind it like water. 3 days later, a forged medical report appeared in the district system, escalating the hallway incident into a formal assault charge. Tian Le, working through his father's channels, was trying to build something that would follow Shan long enough to matter. Shan had expected this. He'd read about Vice Chief Yang once, years from now, an article about the eventual corruption arrest, brief, buried on page 7. One detail had stuck. 6 million in bribe cash, sealed in a waterproof case inside the stone base of a garden fountain, left there by a demolition contractor seeking permits he shouldn't have received. The villa was scheduled for demolition in 14 months. Shan wasn't waiting 14 months. He spent 2 days on public records from the library, property plans, permit filings, survey maps. He tracked the security booth's shift patterns from the street over 2 mornings. He cataloged Tian Lei's routine: home before 11, second floor light on until midnight, gone by 7. He put together a kit from what he already owned: dark clothing, climbing gloves, a bolt cutter from his grandfather's shed, and a trolley borrowed from the alley behind the bread shop on 5th Street. He charged the electric clippers twice before he left the house. He set his alarm for 2:50 a.m. The villa's north face had no cameras. He'd confirmed that from the street. 1 guard patrolled on a cycle of 22 minutes, regular enough to prove he'd stopped expecting anything to happen. Shan went over the wall between the guard's 3rd and 4th rounds, in the window between the east corner lamp dimming and the guard re-emerging from the south path. He had 80 seconds. He used 40 getting over, landing on the grass strip without sound, and going still. He listened. The garden was formal: hedges, stone paths, a dry, circular fountain at the center with a stone basin about a meter deep. He moved along the hedge line to the fountain and found the seam in the base with his fingertips, pressing until the panel shifted. Inside, 2 heavy duffel bags, zippered, waterproof. He checked the contents by penlight, banded cash, real, and loaded them onto the trolley. 6 million. Enough to start what needed to be built. He had 12 minutes remaining. He used 3 of them on the second-floor stairs. Tian Lei's room was the second on the right. The boy slept on his back with his mouth open, which made the job easier. The clippers were quiet on the lowest setting. Shan worked quickly and without ceremony, the way you do something you've already decided on. When he was done, Tian Lei's head was smooth. He gathered the cut hair and left it on the pillow beside him, neatly arranged. So Tian Lei would see it when he woke up. He was back over the wall and rolling the trolley down the service alley before the guard finished his next round. Vice Chief Yang's arrest made the city news 2 weeks later. An anonymous tip, documentation provided, submitted to an investigative journalist whose name Shan had looked up because the man had, in the original timeline, broken the story anyway. Just 2 years later than he needed to. Shan had photographed the documents in the study rather than taking them, which kept everything clean. Tian Lei returned to school, wearing a hat the dress code technically prohibited, and sat in a seat the administration had quietly reassigned while his father was under investigation. His bodyguards were gone. No one was paying for them now. He stared at the front of the classroom with the expression of someone who had recently discovered that the world did not automatically belong to them. He hadn't accepted it yet. The following Thursday at 2 a.m., he approached Shan's family home in Shantytown with accelerant and the kind of focus that comes from a person whose entire self-image has just collapsed. The fire didn't catch well, the walls were old and damp, and the neighbor's outdoor camera had recorded all of it clearly. Police picked him up that morning. He was still wearing the same jacket. His father was already in custody. The lawyer the family could now afford was considerably less capable than their previous one. Tian Lei went from class representative with 2 bodyguards to bald, charged with arson, and genuinely homeless in under a month. Shan watched the arrest from the second floor of a tea shop across the street, eating a pork bun, and felt something that wasn't satisfaction. Something more like the particular quiet when a calculation resolves exactly as you wrote it. The bar on Old District Lane had been empty for 8 months. Shan bought it for 40,000 cash, which the seller accepted in under 10 minutes because the money was real and the buyer didn't negotiate. He converted the back rooms, installed a secondary office, reinforced the storage. He was not opening a bar. He arranged a meeting with Deputy Director Dong. Dong arrived late, looking at a 16-year-old sitting across from him in a building that appeared, somehow, to belong to this teenager, and his expression hovered between amusement and mild offense. He accepted the tea that was poured for him, without looking at who poured it. Shan put a folder on the table. Inside was documentation of every payment Dong had taken over 4 years. Dates, amounts, and in several cases the names attached. Shan knew this because the federal case that eventually cleaned out the precinct had produced a declassified report he'd read in another life. He hadn't invented anything. He hadn't needed to. The amusement left Dong's face. Then the offense left too. Shan explained what he wanted. Not obedience. Dong would keep doing his job, mostly as before. But when Shan needed information moved, an arrest timed, or a file pulled, Dong would help. In return, the folder stayed closed. Dong asked if this was blackmail. Shan said it was a partnership. Dong looked at the folder for a long time. Then he adjusted his jacket, picked up the tea, and asked what Shan needed first. What he needed first was a referral into Lord Hu's casino. Lord Hu's operation ran out of a converted waterfront warehouse on the east side of the city, the kind of building that looked abandoned from the street and alive from the inside. Entry required a referral from someone already inside. Not a password, not a card, just a name attached to trust. The way underground things work. Shan's referral came through a distribution contact of the bar's former owner, a mid-level supplier who believed he was doing a favor for a serious young man working on behalf of an older principal. Shan let the impression stand. He dressed plainly, said little, and arrived at the warehouse's unmarked rear entrance on a Thursday night at 10, when the tables were full and the staff were busy enough not to scrutinize a new face too carefully. The floor was loud and dim, cigarette haze, stacked chips, the low murmur of focused money. Shan stood at the edge of the room for 40 minutes before he sat down at anything. He wasn't studying the games. He was studying the people running them. Every dealer had a tell. Not the simple ones, not the finger tap or the micro-hesitation before a controlled result. Those were trained out. What remained were structural patterns, the kind that lived in the body rather than the conscious mind, the way a shoulder loaded slightly when someone knew the outcome, the way fabric shifted at the collar when breathing changed rhythm. Shan had spent 3 years in service learning to read micro-movement in people who were actively trying to kill him. A casino dealer trying to run a fixed game was a much simpler problem. He sat at the dice table and placed his first bet at 20,000, which drew no attention in a room where the minimums started at 10. He lost, he placed another, adjusted for what he'd observed, and lost again. On the third bet he recalibrated. He'd been reading the shoulder, but the real signal lived in the neck, a slight tightening at the collar when the predetermined result was a 3 or lower. He shifted focus. He bet against the low numbers. He won. Won again. By the 5th round, the dealer was watching him with an expression that had stopped being professional and become something more careful. Shan kept going. The table supervisor appeared by the 7th round. By the time he'd turned his stake into over 800,000, the supervisor was on a radio. Lord Hu arrived on the 10th round. He was heavy-set, wearing a gold watch Shan recognized from a newspaper photo taken at some charity event in 2017, and he had the posture of a man who had not been genuinely surprised in a long time. He stood behind the onlookers and watched 2 rounds without expression, then gestured for the dealer to rotate out. The new dealer's tell was different. Shorter window, different muscle group. Shan read it in 3 throws. He called a 333. The rarest result at the table, the one the house weighted most heavily against, the one that almost never came out of an honest throw and never came out of a controlled one unless something had gone wrong. The dealer threw. The dice came to rest. 333. The room went quiet in the specific way a room does when the math has visibly broken down. Lord Hu looked at the dice for a long moment. He looked at Shan. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, not yet. More the slow, deliberate recalibration of a man trying to figure out what category this young stranger belonged to. He invited Shan to his private office. The office was at the back of the warehouse, behind a reinforced door, down a corridor that smelled of old smoke and money. A guard waited outside. Lord Hu settled into a chair behind a desk and looked at Shan with the patience of a man who had handled problems quietly for 20 years and saw no reason to change his method now. He asked, directly, how Shan had done what he'd done. Shan told him he had good eyes. Lord Hu smiled at that, a smile that had nothing warm in it, and said that his dealers had good eyes too, and that people with good eyes who used them at his tables typically left with considerably less than they'd arrived with, or didn't leave at all. Shan said he understood. He said Lord Hu had a problem with a small personal security gap in his shift rotation on the North Corridor that he might want to address before it became someone else's opportunity. He said this calmly and specifically, and Lord Hu's expression shifted fractionally, because the specificity was real and could only have come from observation. Then Shan stood, said he would be leaving with his winnings, and waited. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Lord Hu was calculating, and the calculation was whether the disruption of stopping Shan outweighed the disruption of what Shan had just demonstrated he could do. A man who could identify a security gap that specifically was either someone you recruited or someone you removed, and removing him here, tonight, with a referral on record and a bar in the old district and an unclear set of connections, that was a messier cost than the money. Lord Hu told him to take the winnings. He said they'd talk again. What happened next was the part Lord Hu hadn't accounted for. The lights went out. The corridor power cut was Shan's own insurance. A simple timer wired to the external supply box. 60 seconds of darkness starting at the moment he'd estimated Lord Hu would reach a decision. In the dark, the guard outside the door was a sound and a position, not a threat. Shan moved first, took the man down with a joint lock that required no visibility to execute, and was back inside the office before Lord Hu had finished standing up. In the dark, skill gaps close very fast. Lord Hu had size and the confidence of a man who had won fights before. What he didn't have was the ability to locate Shan by sound, because Shan moved without noise. a decade of training in environments where sound meant death. Lord Hu threw twice and hit nothing. Shan hit 3 times, precisely, in the sequence that ended the conversation fastest. When the lights returned, Lord Hu was on the floor of his own office breathing carefully through a nose that was no longer straight. Shan took the cash bag that had been sitting on the desk, a secondary yield he'd anticipated from the night, and left through the North Corridor's service exit, the gap in the rotation he'd mentioned, the one Lord Hu hadn't yet addressed. He walked out into the waterfront night air with tens of millions in combined winnings, his hands steady, his pulse at resting pace. He flagged a cab 2 streets over and gave an address on the other side of the city. He had the money he needed. Now he needed the people. Dragon Shield Securities did not exist yet, but the name was already decided. Shan had been turning over the architecture for weeks. A licensed private security company, operating legally, contracted primarily to businesses in the old district where Lord Hu's collection people had made protection genuinely necessary. It would serve 2 purposes: legitimate income and a structured network of people who could move when Shan needed them to move. He needed veterans, men who'd served, who'd done real things, who were now somewhere between the military's demands and civilian life's smaller dimensions and finding neither quite right. Brother Ping was working odd jobs in the River District when Shan found him. He'd been an army man, special operations support, not Tier 1, but the kind of work that required the same durability. He'd been discharged 18 months ago and had a handful of former colleagues in similar positions and a younger brother with a heart condition that a civilian surgeon had quoted at $1 million+ to repair. He ran his hands over his face a lot when he talked. He kept his boots laced and double-knotted even when there was no reason to. Shan met him through a contact at the Veterans Association in the back of a noodle shop on a Tuesday afternoon and told him what he was building and what he was offering: salary, structure, and the satisfaction of work that was real. Ping listened without interrupting, which Shan appreciated. Most people interrupted when they got nervous. When Shan finished, Ping said there was something Shan should know before he agreed to anything. He told Shan about his brother. The boy was 17. Biff, they called him, Ping's younger brother, with a cardiac defect that had been undiagnosed until it nearly killed him at a school sports day the previous year. The surgeon's estimate for the repair was $1 million too. Ping had been working every hour available since the diagnosis. He'd saved $400,000. The surgeons had said the window was closing, the condition was progressing, and the longer it waited, the more complex the procedure became. He wasn't telling Shan this as leverage, he said. He was telling him because it meant he was not entirely free. If he agreed to work for Shan, and then the company failed or something went wrong, his brother paid the price. He needed Shan to understand that. Shan looked at Ping for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket, took out a sealed envelope, and set it on the table. Inside was a check for $1 million. Ping looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it. He asked what this was. Shan told him it was for the surgery. He told Ping to book the procedure for next week. He told him not to think of it as a debt because it wasn't. It was the cost of having the right man running the right company, and the right man shouldn't be working distracted. Ping's jaw was tight. He sat very still for a long moment, and Shan let the silence hold because it needed to hold. A man absorbing something like that didn't need anyone talking at him. Then Ping asked when they started. Shan said Monday. Ping nodded once, picked up the envelope carefully, the way you handle something that means more than its weight, and slid it into his jacket. He showed up Monday at 7 in the morning with 8 men behind him, all former military, all with the same double-knotted laces, and Dragon Shield Securities opened its doors. Biff's surgery went well. He was discharged in 11 days, pale and thinner and quietly astonished to be alive, and the day Ping brought him to the company's offices to say thank you, the boy stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and looked at Shan, and didn't say anything for a long moment, because there wasn't language for the specific weight of what had been given. Shan told him to rest and eat more vegetables. Biff laughed, which was the point. Lin Shi started tutoring Shan a month into the semester. The arrangement was her idea. She'd heard from a teacher that he was struggling with the material, which wasn't true, but was a reasonable conclusion to draw from a student who spent half of every class looking out the window. He let the story stand. He sat across from her in the library on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, working through problems he could solve in 30 seconds with his eyes closed. working through them slowly enough to seem like he was learning. He was, in fact, learning other things. How she held her pen, pressed too hard, always, ink bleeding slightly at the strokes. How she corrected her own mistakes without erasing, drawing a neat line through the error and writing the correction beside it. How she brought two pencils and used neither, defaulting to the pen every time despite clearly intending otherwise. He cataloged these things the way a soldier catalogs terrain, not sentimentally, just carefully. She was alive, she was here. In his original life, she'd been gone by winter. He noticed, over the weeks, that the tutoring sessions had shifted slightly in character. She stayed later than the material required. She asked him questions that had nothing to do with mathematics, about his family, about what he wanted to do after school, about the scar on the back of his hand that he'd invented a plausible but vague explanation for. She brought 2 portions of food and left one in front of him without comment, the same as she apparently did with everything, just quietly providing, without announcement. He noticed all of it. He filed it away carefully and did not respond to it, which was harder than anything else he'd done since regressing. One Thursday in late October, she finished reviewing a problem set and sat back and looked at him directly and told him how she felt. She didn't dress it up. She said she knew it was strange given the context, given that he'd helped her in September and she'd been aware of him differently since, and she understood if it was strange. But she wanted to say it. The room was quiet around them. Shan looked at the table for a moment. Then he told her he couldn't. He told her it had nothing to do with her. He said, and this was true, that his life was complicated in ways he couldn't explain, and that being close to him carried risks she couldn't see yet, and he wasn't willing to put her in a position where those risks landed on her. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see that she was trying to decide whether this was a kind rejection or an honest one. He hoped she read it as honest. Because it was. She packed her pencils, both of them, neither of which she'd used, into her case, and said she understood. She said she'd see him Thursday. She left. He sat at the library table for 3 minutes after she walked out, which was longer than the situation required, but the chair felt heavier than it had when he sat down, and he let it. Yu Chen arrived at the start of the following month. He transferred into Shan's class under a false name, a cousin's identity, borrowed papers, the kind of clean bureaucratic cover that money made available. He sat 2 rows back and slightly to the right, which put him in the natural sightline of someone who wanted to observe without appearing to. He was quiet in class. He participated correctly in group work. He dressed slightly better than anyone else without making it obvious. Shan made him in 6 minutes. Not from anything dramatic. Not a slip, not a recognition. From the way he watched. Most people in a classroom watched the teacher, or their own notes, or the person they were romantically interested in. Yu Chen watched Shan, not constantly, he was too careful for that, but in a pattern. The intervals were consistent, the angle was always slightly indirect, never straight on. He was cataloging. Shan knew the technique because he'd used it himself. He knew the Chen family. He knew Xuan Chen, the eldest, the one who'd spiked the water and organized the betrayal that ended his first life. And he knew that Yu Chen was the younger one, not the planner, not the heir apparent, but a psychopathic second son whose particular usefulness to the family was that he had no hesitation where others might pause. He'd been sent to assess Shan, which meant Xuan was already aware of him. Shan spent the next 3 days deciding what to do about it, and concluded that the most efficient use of Yu Chen's presence was to use him. He approached Jai that afternoon on the way to the canteen. Jai immediately asked what was happening and why Shan had his planning expression on. Shan told him there was a new student in class who was probably going to try to befriend him, and when that happened, Jai should let it happen and pass along anything Shan told him to pass along. Jai asked if this was going to be dangerous. Shan said probably not for Jai specifically. Jai said that was not as reassuring as Shan seemed to think it was. But he agreed, because that was what Jai did. He agreed, complained accurately about it, and then showed up anyway. Yu Chen made his approach within the week. He positioned it through a shared interest in a mobile game that Jai played obsessively, engineered a conversation, and had established a casual friendship within 10 days. He was practiced at it. Shan gave him credit for the technique, while noting everything it revealed about the family that had trained him. The false information Shan fed through Jai was specific and operational. There was going to be a military inspection of all private security firms in Jiuning City, scheduled for the following month. with particular focus on companies operating in the old district. The inspection was fabricated entirely. But to someone trying to understand Dragon Shield Security's vulnerabilities, the possibility of a military audit would be interesting and actionable, and an actionable piece of information tells you what a person does when they think they have leverage. Yu Chen did exactly what Shan expected. He passed it upward. Within 2 weeks, Shan had a partial picture of how the Chen family's information pipeline worked. Who moved messages, how quickly, through which intermediaries. It wasn't complete, but it was enough to plan around. Meanwhile, something darker was becoming visible in the old district. People were going missing. Not loudly, no dramatic disappearances, no crime scenes. The kind of missing that happened in neighborhoods where people didn't have anyone to make calls on their behalf. A man who slept rough near the south gate, not seen for 3 weeks. A woman who'd worked cleaning jobs and hadn't shown up to the one that paid her best. A runaway teenager spotted near the warehouses who nobody could find afterward. Shan noticed because he'd built Dragon Shield's route to cover that ground, and his people had started flagging gaps. A door propped where it shouldn't be, a smell from a building that hadn't had occupants in 2 years, a van running at odd hours. He followed it himself, 2 nights in a row, before he was certain enough. Then he found Tian Lei. Not where he expected to find him. The boy was bound and gagged in the basement of a building off the South Industrial Strip, terrified and dehydrated, and nowhere near the criminal ecosystem that Shan was now circling. Tian Lei had wandered somewhere he shouldn't have, probably following some lead about reclaiming something he'd lost, and had ended up collected by the same operation that was collecting everyone else. Shan untied him without ceremony, told him to keep his mouth shut, and got him out of the building. Tian Lei asked no questions on the way, which was the most sensible thing he'd done in their entire acquaintance. What was inside that building, past the basement? That was the next problem. The one that was going to cost time and coordination, and the kind of evidence that needed to be airtight before anyone could move on it. Because it wasn't just missing persons. It was something considerably worse. He spent one more night confirming what he suspected before he brought Ping into it. The building off the South Industrial Strip had multiple floors active below ground, a fact visible only from the ventilation configuration on the exterior and the power draw from the municipal supply line, which Shan pulled from a contact at the utilities office through Director Dong. What was happening inside was organ harvesting. Coordinated, clinical, run on people who had no one looking for them and no paperwork that would surface quickly when they disappeared. He'd known about the Chen family's involvement in this trade from his previous life, not specifically, not with addresses, but from the shape of how they operated. They didn't dirty their own hands. They found an existing criminal infrastructure, invested in it quietly, and let it run beneath something legitimate. Lord Hu's gambling network had been the visible layer. This was what ran underneath. He told Ping on a Wednesday morning, plainly and completely, over coffee in the back office of Dragon Shield's headquarters. He laid out what he knew, what he'd confirmed, and what he needed. Ping listened with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set. He didn't ask how Shan knew what he knew. He'd stopped asking that some weeks ago, around the time it became clear that Shan's knowledge arrived from somewhere that explanation would not satisfactorily account for. He asked instead how many men they needed, and whether they were going in clean or prepared for resistance. Shan said prepared. He said the people running the facility would not be unarmed. Ping said he'd have 6 men ready by midnight. He said they'd need a camera capable of recording in low light, a medical contact on standby, and Director Dong's people positioned to receive what they brought out. Shan had already arranged all 3. Ping noted this without surprise and finished his coffee. They went in at 1 a.m. The entry was through a ground-level loading bay, the kind with a rolling door and a manual override that Shan had already identified and pre-mapped. 2 guards outside, positioned for visibility rather than tactical effectiveness. Ping's people handled them efficiently and without unnecessary escalation. Inside, a corridor, then a stairwell going down, then 2 more levels of activity that the building's exterior gave no sign of. The smell reached them before the visuals did. The lower floors were divided into sections. Some held equipment, some held people. The people were in cages. The word was clinical, but it was accurate, and Shan used it deliberately in his own thinking, because softening the language would have softened the response, which he couldn't afford. Men, women, several whose ages were ambiguous in the bad lighting, held in divided spaces along a corridor that ran the length of the underground floor. Some were conscious, some weren't. A uniformed figure at the far end registered Dragon Shield's entry and reached for something, and Ping crossed the distance before the figure finished raising it and put him on the floor. Shan walked the corridor with a camera. He recorded everything, not quickly, carefully, systematically, the way evidence is recorded by someone who has spent time in situations where the documentation matters as much as the action. Every section, every face he could capture that was clear enough to use. Every piece of equipment, every document he could find on the nearby workstation that hadn't been locked or powered down. He spent 14 minutes in the building after the guards were handled. His team brought all the captives out through the loading bay. The medical contact Shan had arranged met them 2 blocks away with a vehicle and enough personnel to begin assessment on the spot. The documents went to Director Dong before dawn, along with the footage, along with specific instructions about timing and delivery. Dong spent 3 hours reviewing everything, and Shan knew from the silence that followed that even a man as thoroughly compromised as Dong understood when something had crossed a line that his own corruption couldn't exist beside. The press conference was held that afternoon. Dong was not a natural performer, which worked in his favor. He read from notes. He presented the documentation without editorializing. He named the building, the operations structure, the number of victims recovered, and the evidence collected on the Chen family's financial connection to the enterprise. He answered questions flatly and specifically. He looked, throughout, like a man doing the most uncomfortable thing he had done in 20 years of avoiding uncomfortable things. Which was true, and which read on camera as exactly the kind of reluctant honesty that people trusted. The story ran on every major outlet by evening. Shan watched the coverage from the bar on Old District Lane and thought about Yu Chen, who would be watching the same footage from somewhere and calculating. Yu Chen calculated quickly. He moved within 48 hours. Lord Hu died in his own warehouse. Yu Chen came personally, which was the kind of decision a person makes when they want it done in a specific way and trust no one else to do it that way. Lord Hu had failed. The casino floor had been cracked by a student. The organ operation had been exposed and documented, and the Chen family's name was now attached to it in ways that required someone to absorb the consequence. Lord Hu was the available candidate. The details of what happened in that warehouse reached Shan through Dong's network 2 days later. Lord Hu had been beaten and then shot, in that order, which told Shan something about Yu Chen's preferences he filed away for later. The warehouse was cleaned afterward with the kind of efficiency that suggested prior experience. Yu Chen showed up at Shan's school the following Monday with a new expression. He'd been wearing patience before, performing the casual friend, the unconcerned transfer student. Now the patience was gone. He sat in his seat and looked at Shan directly for the first time, the way a person looks when they've decided the pretense has ended. Shan looked back briefly and returned to his notes. The attack on Dragon Shield's reputation came from the kind of angle Shan had expected: public pressure, managed appearance. Yu Chen organized a protest outside the company's old district office. A crowd of people carrying signs about unlicensed security operations and neighborhood intimidation, filmed by cameras that had been placed before the crowd arrived, suggested by a social media account that had been dormant until the previous week. The protest aired on 2 local channels. The optics were functional if not inspired. Shan had known about it 4 days in advance. He knew because Director Dong had flagged the permit application, a crowd assembly permit, filed under a civic association name that had been registered 6 months earlier with no activity, and Shan had cross-referenced the name against everything he knew about the Chen family's shell structure. One connection, a property management subsidiary. Thin, but enough. He arranged with Dong to have uniformed officers present at the protest. Not to interfere, just to be visible. He arranged for a streaming account to broadcast the event live, managed from Dragon Shield's offices, which he ran himself from a laptop. And he tipped a journalist, the same investigative reporter who'd handled Vice Chief Yang's story about the Civic Association's registration and the shell company link. The protest began at noon. By 12:15, the journalist had published a brief piece naming the organizer. By 12:30, Dong's officers had confirmed the identity of 3 individuals in the crowd against a list of known Chen family associates, which was information they were legally permitted to act on if other matters warranted attention. One of those individuals had an outstanding warrant on an unrelated matter. Dong made the arrest on camera in real time in the middle of the protest. The streaming account was running. The protest's intended message, that Dragon Shield was a dangerous operation that needed to be investigated, collapsed in the footage of a man being arrested in the middle of carrying a sign about it, identified by his own face, the camera close enough to be unambiguous. Within 2 hours, the story had reversed entirely. Shan watched the arrest on his laptop from the back office and felt the particular satisfaction of watching something fall apart because it had been built on the assumption that he wasn't watching. He closed the laptop and ate the cold rice that had been sitting beside it since morning, and started thinking about what Yu Chen would do next. What Yu Chen did next was Jai's mother. The call came on a Saturday. Jai rang at 6 a.m., which was not a time he ever rang anyone voluntarily, and the sound in his voice when Shan picked up was not a sound Shan had heard from him before. Not fear exactly, but the particular register of someone who has realized the world contains dimensions they hadn't previously accounted for. His mother had been taken the night before. She'd been walking back from her late shift at the laundry 2 blocks from their apartment. There was a message waiting on Jai's phone when he woke up, from a number that didn't exist in any directory, giving an address and a time and the information that she was being held somewhere with C4 rigged to the building's support structure. The address was an abandoned brick factory on the city's north edge. The time given was noon. Shan told Jai to stay at home. He said it calmly and specifically and repeated it once. Jai asked what he was going to do. Shan said he was going to the factory. Jai said he should go too. Shan said no, and the way he said it made Jai stop arguing, because the voice was not the voice of the boy who sat beside him in class. It was something older and steadier that didn't invite negotiation. He found Jai an hour later sitting on the steps outside his apartment building in the cold, arms around his knees, not going anywhere, just needing to be somewhere that wasn't inside. Shan sat beside him. Neither of them said anything for a minute. Then Jai said he was sorry. He said he knew Shan had told him to be careful about Yu Chen, and he'd been careful, but clearly not careful enough, and he was sorry. Shan said it wasn't on him. He said it clearly and meant it. This was on Shan, because Yu Chen was his problem, and Jai's mother was being used as a message, and messages are sent by people who have run out of other options. Jai absorbing blame for that was not something Shan was willing to allow. Jai was quiet again. He rubbed the back of his hand across his face. Shan told him the woman was still alive. Yu Chen needed her alive for the standoff to work. He told Jai he'd have her home before evening. He said it the way you say something when you've already decided it's true. Then he went to get ready. He went alone. Ping argued against it, briefly and professionally, making the case that 4 men with the right positioning could neutralize the exterior snipers faster than one. Shan said the snipers would read a 4-man approach, and Jai's mother would die before they reached the door. Ping said 2 men then. Shan said no. Ping looked at him for a long moment, the expression of a man who has served long enough to recognize when a decision has already been made, and stood down. Shan took a grappling rig, a tactical vest, and the particular kind of mental preparation that happens when you've walked into situations like this before. And the main thing you've learned is that speed is more important than comfort. The factory was 3 stories, brick, roughly rectangular. He circled it once from 200 meters before approaching. 3 exterior positions, 1 on the north roofline, 1 covering the east entrance from a fire escape, 1 inside the building at a window. Standard triangulated setup. Professional enough to take seriously, not professional enough to be flawless, the roofline position had a visibility gap on the northwest approach of about 40 degrees, because whoever placed that sniper had read the building's main access points and not the maintenance ladder on the building's blind side. Shan went up the maintenance ladder. The roofline position went down without a sound. The man on the fire escape position was harder. The angle required Shan to cross a gap he had 4 seconds to cross cleanly, and he crossed it in 3, which was the kind of calculation that either works or it doesn't. It worked. The 3rd position, inside at the window, Shan reached from the upper floor, coming down behind rather than up from below, and that one ended very quickly. 3 positions, 8 minutes. He descended to the factory floor. The interior was large and dim, machinery gone, concrete dust, the smell of brick and old oil. Yu Chen stood near the center of the space with Jai's mother seated on a metal chair behind him, wrists zip-tied to the armrests, a piece of tape across her mouth. She was conscious and her eyes were tracking, which meant she was okay in the ways that mattered most. Beside Yu Chen stood a bodyguard who was large enough and positioned correctly enough that Shan gave him a moment's genuine attention. Against the far wall, an attack dog, a large one, was held on a restraint, but alert to the new presence in the room. Yu Chen had a detonator in his right hand. He was dressed well, even now. The particular vanity of someone who believed the scenario gave him control. He told Shan he'd been waiting for him. Shan said nothing. He was reading the space, the cable runs for the C4 charges, the structural column positions, the dog's field of range on the restraint, the bodyguard's weight distribution. He was also watching Yu Chen's hand on the detonator, specifically the tendon alignment above the thumb joint. Yu Chen talked. He talked about the casino, the organ lab, the protest, all of his operations that had failed against Shan's interference. He talked with the particular intensity of someone who had prepared this conversation and needed it to land. Shan let him talk, because talking meant the hand on the detonator was stationary, and stationary was what he needed. He moved when Yu Chen paused. The grappling rig crossed the distance in an arc that the bodyguard, who was positioned for a ground approach, wasn't angled to intercept. Shan came in fast and low from the right and hit Yu Chen's wrist before the hand could complete the detonator press. A joint strike, 2 fingers, the nerve cluster below the thumb, and the detonator hit the concrete and skittered 6 feet. The bodyguard came in a second later, and Shan went through him in 4 moves, fast and mechanical, the way you handle a skilled opponent when you don't have time to be creative. The dog came off the wall when the restraint anchor tore loose and reached Shan in under a second. He dropped to one knee, braced, and used the animal's own momentum to redirect it past him. The animal hit the ground, reassessed, started to turn, and Shan was already past it and back at Yu Chen. Yu Chen had retrieved the detonator with his left hand. Shan hit the detonator a second time, harder, and it broke in 2 pieces. He took Yu Chen down and kept him down, one hand on the back of his neck, one knee on his spine, his breathing steady and his voice calm when he told the man that it was over. Yu Chen struggled for about 20 seconds. Then he stopped. Shan zip-tied his wrists with material from his vest pocket, crossed the floor to Jai's mother, and removed the tape and cut the restraints. She looked up at him and her eyes were full, relief, terror still draining out, something beyond what he could easily categorize. He told her she was okay. He told her Jai was waiting outside the perimeter and she'd see him in 15 minutes. She nodded, jaw trembling, and let him help her to her feet. Director Dong's people were already positioned outside. The arrest was clean and documented. Yu Chen was processed, charged on multiple counts: kidnapping, the C4 setup, conspiracy connected to the organ operation, and placed in custody that same evening. Shan stood in the parking area outside the precinct at 9 that night and breathed cold air and let the tension drain out in the careful, deliberate way a person does when they know they need to be functional again soon. Ping appeared at his shoulder, without being asked, said nothing, and stood beside him until the breathing normalized. That was what Ping did. It was worth more than most things. Yu Chen was in custody for 11 days before he died. The Chen family's calculation was transparent and, in its way, efficient. A living Yu Chen, facing the charges he was facing, with the evidence that existed, would eventually produce testimony. A dead one couldn't. The family had enough reach inside the system to move something small into a cell, a razor blade, taped inside a meal tray's seam, and Yu Chen, who was many things but not naive, understood the message when he found it. He used it. The guard who found him described the cell as very quiet. The family released a brief statement expressing grief. No one with knowledge of the situation expressed much surprise. Shan read the report from Dong and sat with it for a moment. Not satisfaction. He'd wanted Yu Chen as a path to Xuan Chen, and that path was now closed. Not guilt either, because everything he'd done had been necessary, and none of it was what had killed Yu Chen in that cell. What had killed Yu Chen in that cell was the family that used him and then calculated that he was more useful silent. He filed Xuan Chen's name in a specific part of his thinking and left it there. That account wasn't closed. It was just deferred. For now, Lin Shi's birthday was in 2 weeks. The party was held at Colonel Lin's residence, a formal garden event. because Lin Shi's father had specific ideas about what a birthday celebration should look like, and Lin Shi had long ago accepted that arguing took more effort than attendance. There were lanterns strung between the garden's old trees, a long table with food that the colonel's staff had spent 2 days preparing, and roughly 40 guests, ranging from family to military colleagues to classmates. Lin Jun arrived with his own luggage of confidence. He was Lin Shi's cousin on her mother's side, aristocratic family, good-looking in a way that he was aware of, the kind of person who entered a room and waited to see who noticed. He found Shan within 10 minutes of arriving, which suggested either that he'd been briefed on who Shan was, or that he'd simply identified the person least absorbed in performing social ease and gravitated toward them as a challenge. He challenged Shan to an archery competition. The garden had an archery setup at the far end, a practice range the colonel maintained, targets at 30 meters, the standard equipment. Lin Jun proposed a blindfolded round, a flying arrow launched by each competitor, judged by accuracy when blindfolded. The implied message was clear enough that several people nearby went quiet, waiting to see how Shan responded. Shan looked at him. He'd known this moment was coming, not because he'd foreseen Lin Jun specifically, he hadn't, but because the environment had already told him what kind of man Lin Jun was, and he'd spent the party's first hour noticing a man near the garden's north entrance who didn't move like a guest. Guests at parties drift. They move toward food, toward faces they recognize, toward whatever is interesting. This man moved in arcs. Patient, subtle arcs. The arc of someone who had a fixed point and was calibrating distance to it. The fixed point was Lin Shi. Shan accepted the archery challenge. He drew his bow with the blindfold already on, having memorized the layout in the 60 seconds before the cloth went over his eyes. The stone arch at the left periphery. The long table at 45 degrees off-center. Lin Jun's position at the competing mark, roughly 9 meters to his right. The target boards 30 meters ahead. The man near the north entrance, 22 meters from where Lin Shi was standing, which put him close enough to be useful, but not so close that anyone would read it as threat. He tracked the man's position by sound and absence. A party has ambient noise, conversation, movement, the small collisions of a crowd. The man near the north entrance produced a particular absence in the sound pattern. The people near him were not talking in the easy, unaware way people talk at parties. They were slightly stiff, slightly conscious of the space beside them without being able to articulate why. Lin Jun drew his bow. The creak of the string reached Shan clearly. Then something shifted in the sound pattern near the north entrance. A sudden movement, a sharp intake of breath from Lin Shi, a heel scrape on stone, and Shan understood that the man had moved, and moved toward her, and the arrow was already in the air. He did not fire at the target board. He raised his bow on the adjusted angle he'd computed the moment he heard the creak of Lin Jun's string, the incoming arrow's approximate flight path, its distance, the deflection angle required, and fired. The incoming arrow shattered 6 feet from where Lin Shi was standing. His second and third arrows hit the board in twin strikes close enough to overlap. In the silence that followed, someone screamed. The man near the north entrance was reaching for his collar. Shan already had the blindfold off by then and was crossing the garden at a pace that wasn't quite running. Controlled, direct. The pace that doesn't alarm crowds but covers ground. He reached the man as the fingers closed around a capsule. He tried to get there in time. He was close. Not close enough. The man swallowed. His knees went down. His color changed in the specific way it changes when something fast-acting is moving through a system, and by the time 2 of the colonel's military staff reached the scene, there wasn't anything to do that would change the outcome. He lasted about 4 minutes. Long enough to say, to the officer leaning over him, that Yu Chen had sent him. Then he was gone. The garden went very quiet. Colonel Lin moved his people quickly, securing the perimeter, getting guests away from the body, calling the right numbers. He was a military man, and he treated the situation as one, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. Lin Shi was standing near the stone arch with her arms wrapped around herself, not shaking, past shaking, the way a person goes past it when the adrenaline has spiked and crashed and left something flat and cold behind. She looked at Shan. He looked back. He wanted to say something useful. Nothing useful arrived. She looked at the target board where 2 arrows had landed close enough to touch, and then at the shattered remains of the third arrow in the grass at her feet, and something moved across her face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite the opposite of it. She said his name. He said he was sorry about her birthday. She almost laughed at that, a short, disbelieving exhale, and then pressed her fingers against her mouth and looked back at the board. Lin Jun had been standing at the shooting mark since it happened, bow still in his hand, watching. He was not, Shan now saw, the man he'd initially seemed. The confidence was still there, but the calculation behind it had changed. He'd just watched a blindfolded competitor process an incoming arrow's flight path in real time and redirect it in under 2 seconds, and whatever he'd thought this competition would demonstrate, it had demonstrated something else entirely. He crossed the garden toward Shan with the bow loose in his hand and an expression that was harder to read than before. He asked, without preamble, who Shan actually was. Shan considered the question. Before he could answer, he felt his phone vibrate in his jacket pocket. Once, the pattern that Dong used for flagged information only. He didn't reach for it, not yet. But he was aware of it the way he was always aware of the periphery. And somewhere else in the city, in a university enrollment office that would process its new student paperwork first thing Monday morning, a file had been submitted under the name Xuan Chen. Shan looked at Lin Jun for a moment. Around them, the garden was still being managed, staff moving guests. Colonel Lin's voice carrying firm and low from the far end, the sounds of a controlled response to something that had gone wrong at a birthday party. He told Lin Jun he was someone who had owed Lin Shi a debt for a long time. Lin Jun looked at him. The bow was still in his hand, loose now at his side, and he wasn't performing anything anymore. The competitive posture, the casual dominance, all of it had drained off in the last 10 minutes. What was left was a man trying to recalibrate against information that didn't fit the original theory. He said that wasn't an answer. Shan said he knew. Lin Jun looked at the shattered arrow in the grass, then at the board with Shan's 2 shots still in it. He asked how long Shan had been training with a bow. Shan said he'd started recently, which was technically true. He'd picked up archery in his 2nd year of service, practiced it through deployment downtime, and been reasonably skilled by the time he died. 16-year-old Shan had never touched a bow. 26-year-old Shan, occupying that body, had simply remembered. Lin Jun seemed to decide that whatever category Shan belonged to, it wasn't any category he'd previously prepared. He pulled the arrow from his own bow and held it loosely between 2 fingers, looking at it rather than at Shan. He said the man who died, the one who'd swallowed the capsule, he'd seen him before. Not here. At a family event, 6 months ago, standing near someone from the Chen family. He'd thought nothing of it at the time. He was telling Shan now because he'd watched Shan scan that man for the last 40 minutes before anything happened, and a person who tracks a threat for 40 minutes before it materializes was a person worth telling things to. Shan took that in. He asked which Chen. Lin Jun said the eldest one, the one studying law. Xuan! Shan kept his face level. He said he appreciated that information. He meant it in a way that Lin Jun couldn't fully understand yet. Lin Jun looked at him for one more second, something undecided working behind his expression, and then nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a conversation without ending what started it, and walked back toward the house. Shan watched him go. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Dong's message was 4 lines. The enrollment confirmation had come through at 5 that afternoon. Xuan Chen, eldest son of the Chen family, registered as a law student at Zhongning University's campus on the north side. The address listed on the registration was an apartment 2 kilometers from Lin Shi's regular tutoring route, which she'd been using on Tuesdays and Thursdays for the past semester. That address wasn't an accident. Someone had looked up her route. Shan read the message twice, then put the phone away. He stood in the garden where a man had died an hour ago, listening to the controlled noise of cleanup around him, and let the pieces settle into their configuration. Yu Chen was gone. Lord Hu was gone. The organ operation was dismantled and documented. Dragon Shield existed and was functional and growing. Director Dong was compromised in the direction Shan needed him. All of that had taken roughly 8 months, and now Xuan Chen was 2 kilometers from Lin Shi's Tuesday route, enrolled in a program that would give him 3 to 4 years of proximity and cover, and the family knew enough about Shan's life to have sent a hitman to a birthday party. They were no longer probing. They had begun. Colonel Lin found him near the garden's east wall, standing away from the remaining guests. The colonel was a man who had the bearing of someone permanently in command, not rigidly, not performatively, just the deep-settled steadiness of a person who had made enough decisions under pressure that the weight of them had become load-bearing. He stood beside Shan without preamble and asked what he knew about what had just happened. Shan said the hitman was connected to the Chen family. He said he'd known there was a possibility of an attempt tonight, based on information he'd been tracking through his security company, and he'd accepted the archery challenge partly to be in a position to intercept if something moved. The colonel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked why Shan hadn't told him in advance. Shan said he'd waited. A warning would have changed how people moved at the party, and changed movement might have changed the hitman's timing or approach in ways that were harder to control than a known variable. He said he understood that was a choice the colonel might reasonably disagree with. The colonel looked at the garden for a long moment. His jaw was tight. He said Lin Shi was his daughter. He said that the next time someone had information that put her in a targeting window, he expected to know about it regardless of the tactical arithmetic. Shan said that was fair. The colonel looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. He asked what exactly Shan did. His security company did background verification and corporate protection for old district businesses. That was the license. He wanted to know what was underneath the license. Shan held the look. He said he was someone who understood the Chen family better than most, who had resources the colonel's official position made difficult to deploy directly, and who had reasons of his own to make sure Lin Shi remained unharmed. He said the colonel could investigate him fully, and he'd cooperate with whatever that produced. He wasn't hiding. The colonel said he would be doing exactly that. Then he said, quietly, not warmly, not harshly, just directly, that Shan's shooting tonight was the best instinctive long-range deflection he had seen outside of controlled conditions, and that Officer Chang had been telling him for several months that something was unusual about a teenager from Shantytown, and that he was beginning to think Chang had been understating it. Shan said Chang was perceptive. The colonel's expression didn't change, but something in it settled. He went back to his guests, and Shan stood by the wall in the evening cold and exhaled slowly. He walked home that night instead of taking a cab. It was 40 minutes on foot, which was what he wanted, time where the only requirement was moving forward and the thinking could happen at its own pace. The city around him was ordinary in the way cities are at 10 at night, the residual noise of restaurants winding down, two men arguing pleasantly about something outside a convenience store, a dog barking twice from an upper window, and then going quiet. He had been home for 8 months. In those 8 months he had prevented one assault, dismantled one corrupt official, won tens of millions from a criminal casino, founded a security company, exposed an organ-harvesting network, neutralized a psychopathic second son, and deflected an assassination attempt at a birthday party. None of it touched Xuan Chen directly. All of it had forced the family's hand in ways that made Xuan Chen's move feel timed rather than spontaneous, which meant Shan had been faster than expected, and they were adjusting. That was a form of progress. It also meant they were no longer waiting to understand what Shan was before deciding what to do about him. They'd decided. He thought about his original life, the linear version, the one where April 12, 2015 had gone the other way. He'd joined the military out of shame, risen through capability and necessity, spent a decade becoming someone who could have protected Lin Shi, if only he'd existed 10 years earlier. The army had given him the tools, the betrayal had given him the reason, and the regression had given him the window. He was still in the window. The question was how much of it remained before Xuan Chen closed it. Xuan Chen was not Yu Chen. That was the critical point. Yu Chen had been dangerous the way a sharpened blade is dangerous. You could see what he was. You could read his escalations. You could map his logic to a specific emotional register and predict his timing. He'd been vicious, and he'd been capable, but he'd been legible. Shan had been able to stay ahead of him because a man who moves primarily on aggression and ego is a man who tells you where he's going. Xuan Chen moved differently. Shan had one clear memory of him from the original life, the bottle of water, the warm smile, the gesture of a man who maintained easy relationships as a matter of professional practice. That was all. No visible temper, no obvious power display. He'd been quietly present in the background of things Shan had later identified as Chen family operations without his name appearing in any of the documentation. He organized from behind his own organization. He was, by every indication, a planner. A planner who had been building toward Shan's death in the original timeline for long enough to place someone inside his military unit. The fact that he was now enrolled 2 kilometers from Lin Shi's routine was not a threat made in anger. It was a statement of capacity, a demonstration that he knew where Lin Shi was and could position himself near her without anyone stopping him, because there was nothing illegal about a law student renting an apartment and attending classes. The message was clear. He could reach her. He was letting Shan know that before doing anything, which was the kind of patience that didn't belong to a person who intended to rush. This was going to be slower and more careful than anything that had come before. And it was going to require things from Shan that the past 8 months hadn't required. Not just tactics, not just preemption, but the ability to operate in an environment where the threat was present and invisible and wearing a law student's face. He stopped outside his building and looked up at his mother's window. The light was still on, which meant she'd waited up. She did that when he came home late, left the light on and didn't say anything about it the next morning, just quietly noted that there were leftovers if he hadn't eaten. He stood on the street for a moment. Somewhere across the city, Jai's mother was home, having spent an evening in a chair, in a dark factory, and then another evening being debriefed by officers who were careful and professional, but still had to ask her things she'd rather not have been asked. Jai was with her. He'd been with her since Shan had her back, and he'd sent one message to Shan's phone around midnight that said only, "She's okay, she's sleeping, thank you." 3 words of actual content, and the rest just Jai being Jai, knowing that the thank you needed to be said even when it was awkward to say it. Brother Ping's brother had been discharged from hospital 3 months ago and was eating better and had started walking to the market in the mornings, which Ping mentioned once without ceremony and didn't mention again because that was how Ping handled things that mattered to him. Dragon Shield had 12 people now and contracts with 9 businesses in the old district, and 2 of those businesses had asked about expanding coverage to additional locations, which meant the company was beginning to have a reputation that wasn't built on fear. Director Dong had, somewhere in the last several months, crossed from reluctant partner to something that looked slightly more like an actual one, not because his character had changed, but because the math had shifted. He was more useful inside Shan's arrangement than outside it, and he was smart enough to understand that. All of this, the whole architecture of what Shan had been built for one purpose. Not Dragon Shield specifically, not the casino winnings or the exposure of the organ network or any individual piece. All of it had been built to give him the ground to stand on when Xuan Chen moved. A base of resources, relationships, and information that couldn't be easily dismantled, staffed by people who were loyal not because they'd been bought, but because they'd been given a reason. He'd needed 8 months to build it. He wasn't certain he had 8 months of runway left. The university enrollment paperwork would be processed Monday. By Tuesday, Xuan Chen would be physically present in classrooms 3 kilometers from where Lin Shi studied, in a city where the Chen family's connections reached into police departments and municipal offices and private security firms. He was coming in clean. No criminal record, no documented connection to what his family did, a legal education that gave him professional cover for the next several years. He would be patient, and he would be pleasant, and he would move when the conditions suited him rather than when emotion told him to. That was what Shan was walking into. Not a fight he could win with a grappling hook and a timed power cut. Something slower and more corrosive. The kind of threat that didn't announce itself until it had already done the thing it intended. He went inside. His mother's light was still on. He stood in the kitchen and heated the food she'd left. A simple thing, 3 minutes at the stove, and ate it standing up, which was a habit from years of eating whenever opportunity allowed, rather than when it was convenient. The apartment was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when someone was asleep in the next room. A radiator ticked. Traffic moved somewhere below. He thought about Lin Jun, standing in the garden with the arrow loose in his fingers, telling him about seeing the hitman at a Chen family event. That had been given freely and specifically, without being asked, the offering of someone who'd reassessed and decided that whatever Shan was, he was on the right side of something. Lin Jun was not going to be an easy person to navigate. He was proud, competitive, and accustomed to defining the terms of his relationships. But he had good instincts, and he'd use them tonight. Shan filed him in the category of people who might matter later, and left it there. He rinsed the dish, set it in the rack, and went to bed. He lay in the dark of a 16-year-old's room with military certificates on the wall that the original Shan had never earned and the future version had never displayed, and he stared at the ceiling and thought about Xuan Chen smiling and handing someone a bottle of water, and how much that smile must have practiced in the mirror to look that easy. Sleep came eventually. It usually did. He'd learned in his first year of service that a body that can sleep under fire can sleep anywhere, and whatever the regression had changed, it hadn't changed that. He'd need the rest. Monday was coming. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, a student in a pressed shirt and a quietly expensive jacket sat down in the first-year law faculty's orientation session. He introduced himself to the people around him with the easy warmth of someone who had done this particular social maneuver many times and found it effortless. He shook hands, smiled at the right moments, and asked just enough questions about his neighbors' backgrounds to seem genuinely interested, without crossing into interrogation. His name, the roster said, was Chen Xuan. Across the city, in Dragon Shield's back office, Dong's flagged alert reached Shan's phone at 9:14 a.m. It contained a photograph from the university's public orientation stream, a group shot posted to the faculty's social media account, 43 students in rows, the kind of institutional photo that no one looks at twice. Shan looked at it twice. Third row, left of center, pressed shirt, the smile that had been practiced until it looked effortless. He set the phone face down on the desk and sat for a moment. Ping was in the next room running a morning briefing. Through the wall, he could hear the low cadence of operational language, shift patterns, contract renewals, a personnel scheduling question, the ordinary business of a company doing ordinary work. Outside these walls, the man who had organized the end of Shan's first life was now sitting in a classroom 3 kilometers from Lin Shi, wearing a law student's face, and waiting. The account between them was a long time open. Shan picked up the phone, looked at the photograph once more, and put it in his pocket. There was work to do.